Hello again and welcome to another one of my unboxings and reviews of two of my watches today. They're both Zeniths, they're both El Primero Chronographs, so let's get started. We'll start off with unboxing. We have a very nice wooden lacquered box here, so we'll pop him out. All of the details and booklets are below there, so we'll move that out of the way. And let's see what's in the box. And here we have my Zenith El Primero Captain Chronograph. Before we start to talk about the watch in particular, I think it's important to, I'll just pop him out of the, you can see him better there. I think it's important to discuss the background and the history of this particular movement and watch. Back in the mid-60s, a race was on to develop the first automatic, that is self-winding chronograph, automatic chronograph. And it was a 3-horse race between Seiko, giants in Japan of course, a conglomerate of Swiss companies including Tag Heuer, or Heuer as they were back then, and Zenith, who were on their own. And there is some dispute about who actually won the race, but all we do know is that all of the movements came out in the early 1969, and of them the only one still here with us is the Zenith El Primero. And I think that's partly because it was a fully integrated brand new movement, whereas the other two companies, what they did was they took an existing movement and added a module on top of it to make it into a chronograph, so it wasn't quite as elegant, wasn't quite as a good solution. And in fact I did read a review from a watchmaker who said when it came to the El Primero, Zenith got it right first time and it was a work of genius. And here we are almost, what, 40 odd years later, they're still being made in the same way. They have been changed a little bit I guess over time, they've updated it, they've improved it, but essentially it's the same watch. And I think that is indicative of the fact that it's a great watch and a great movement. So I'm resisting temptation to speed up because last time I made one of these videos my camera struggled to autofocus as I moved the watch around, so I'm not going to do that just now. It's important also to know that this is a column wheel chronograph, which is the more expensive, more difficult, and I think the better option when it comes to chronographs in comparison to the cheaper, more common lever actuated chronographs, which you'll find on things like the 7750 ETAs and indeed the 1861 Omega Speedmaster movements. Another important element of the El Primero is that it's a high beat movement. It runs at 36,000 beats per hour, which they call VPH, 36,000 VPH, and that's a little unusual these days. Most watches now run at 28,000 and some, such as the Speedmaster, run at 21,000. And the idea is that the faster the beat, the more accurate the watch can be in theory. So now moving on to my actual watch. It's a Captain Chronograph. It has a silver sunburst dial with recessed counters for the subdials, and it's got a date at 6 o'clock. A little unusual for Zenith, they normally put the dates at 4 o'clock. It's a little bit of a quirk of theirs. And it's a 42mm case, and it's waterproof to 50 meters, which isn't very waterproof really these days. But that's okay, for me it's a dress watch. I love it. And looking at the dial in more detail, the hands, the subdials and the batons are all made in 18 karat rose gold, whereas the seconds counter of the chronograph is blue steel. It's very fine, very easy to see and very elegant. So we'll start him off and hopefully my camera can capture some of those details. It's a beautiful day here today, so the sun's out and I'm having difficulty trying to work out the best way of filming this, but hopefully we'll get there in the end. And as you can see, I've turned it over now to show you the display back, where you can see the El Primero movement there ticking away. I hope the camera can catch that. It's a beautifully finished movement. It's got both blued and polished screws. I believe one or the other is for assembly and the other is for adjustment. That just shows the details that Zenith go into with their movements, a little bit like JLC. And it also shows that they are a true manufacturer of movements. They make everything themselves, unlike quite a lot of high-end, so-called high-end brands these days who buy in a lot of their movements and so on. Now, going back to the history of the watch, we are quite lucky still to have it, because back in the early 70s with the Quartz Crisis, which decimated the Swiss watch industry, the order came down from the American owners of Zenith to destroy all of the mechanical watchmaking tools and tooling. Just dump it, scrap it, it's no good anymore, everyone's going to Quartz. And fortunately, as I say, for us, the chief watchmaker of the time at Zenith in Switzerland, a chap called Charles Vermont, I'm not sure of the spelling quite there, he said, actually no, I don't want to do that, that is a crime. There are decades and decades of labour and skill and money in these tools and tooling. They might be quite small, but they're beautifully made. They're almost impossible to replace, and to replace them would cost millions and millions. So what he did in secret was, against the orders from management in America, he didn't scrap them, he actually hid them. He hid them in an attic of the factory, and he also spent a long time carefully writing down and cataloguing every single tool and how it's used to make a movement from start to finish, perhaps in the hope that one day, 100 years from now, somebody may find it and be interested enough to want to make one again. And as it turned out, that was quite a good idea, because not long after the factory was sold once again from the American buyers to some other owners, and in around 81, another Swiss company, a local company called Ebel, came knocking and said they wanted perhaps to make a mechanical chronograph again, not a quartz, a mechanical chronograph. And they asked the question, can you still make the El Primero Movement for us? And the answer was, yes, we can. So all the tools were dusted down, brought down, and production of the El Primero Movement and other movements commenced again. And then with the renewed interest in mechanical watches in the mid-80s, another company came knocking and wanted to use the El Primero Movement in one of their famous models, and that was Rolex. And they wanted to reissue the Cosmograph Daytona, which had died years before. So sure enough, Zenith sold the movements to Rolex, who used them in the reborn Cosmograph. They didn't just take the movement as is though. Rolex being Rolex, they did a few tweaks, they lost a date, and they detuned the movement down to 28,000 VPH from 36,000. Now there's various reasons why they might want to do that, but I believe the main one was that they wanted to keep a consistent service interval for all their models throughout the range. And with the El Primero running so fast, they were worried that maybe it needed a more regular servicing, so they detuned it to make sure it could last whatever the 5 years it was at the time, interval between services for all their models. And that continued on from, I think, 88 was when the first Rolex Cosmograph arrived, and that continued right on to the year 2000, at which point Zenith had been sold to another big conglomerate, and that conglomerate said we didn't want to sell our movements outside our own company anymore. We have use for them, there's a limited number, and so Rolex had to go off and develop their own chronograph movement, which they did, and it's very damn good as well. It's very successful. I got one, and that came out I think in the year 2000. So as you can see, the Zenith El Primero and the Rolex Cosmograph are quite closely intertwined in history. Another important point is that Zenith aren't a huge company. They don't make millions and millions of movements each year. In fact, they make about 40,000, only 40,000 a year. And I have read that in the whole history, 40 odd years of making the El Primero, they've only made around 600,000 movements in total. Now that compares to someone like ETA, who make 1,750,000 chronograph movements every single year. Now this fact had a strange kind of impact on Rolex because they couldn't get as many movements as they wanted, so those that they did get, they mainly put into their more expensive precious metal watches, the white gold, yellow gold, rose gold, platinum watches of the day, and they didn't make very many stainless steel Rolex Daytonas. Consequently, in the 90s, they were in huge demand and huge years-long waiting lists, and if you could get one, then you could flip it the next day and make thousands by selling it to somebody else who didn't want to wait. And the reason was because Zenith had a limited production capacity of their El Primeros, and of course they also needed them for their own models. So now let's move on and talk about this particular watch. I'll take off my Speedmaster FO-IS and we'll pop on this one for a wristwatch check. And here we are. It's, as I said before, a 42mm case. Sits very flat on the wrist, very slim movement, which the El Primero is. And on a strap in particular, it's very kind of elegant, quite dressy. I'm left-handed. I wear my watch on my left hand, so it's important that the watch isn't too fat, because otherwise it gets banged on things as I reach for things and whatnot. The lugs are very elegant, nicely polished and beveled. I wish my camera could focus a little bit closer so you can see the details a wee bit better, but this will have to do for now. I'll take it off again and just leave him sitting there ticking away. Other aspects of the watch, as all El Primeros, it doesn't hack. That is to say, when you pull out the crown, it doesn't stop running. Some folks don't like that. For me, it's never been an issue. I can get it to within a second or so of the true time. So the fact it doesn't hack is just one of those little quirks of the El Primero movement, which isn't really an issue for me. Now, I've had this since 2010. I think it cost me £4,000, I think. It was, at the time, retailing at £4,800. After several cups of tea and biscuits and an hour's worth of negotiation at the dealers, I got it for £4,000, which was okay. Though in truth, discounts are easy to get on Zeniths, a little bit like JLC. They do depreciate quite a lot in the first year or two, so that's great news if you want a great watch and you're prepared to buy second hand. They'll lose 40% in the first year. Not so good for me, for someone who buys new. But I guess without the massive branding and marketing budget behind it like Omega and Rolex, the likes of JLC and Zenith do struggle on the market unfairly, if you ask me, because they're great watches and great movements. But for a watch enthusiast, it means you can get some fantastic watches at a great price. Well, this video is going to be more than 10 minutes long, I think, so I'll have to split it into two parts because we've still got the other Zenith to discuss, which is over there in the box, and I'll do that in a separate video which will include the conclusions of both watches of this particular review. I will finish off this video though by saying that this is probably my favourite watch that I own. It's not the most expensive, it's not the most practical, but somehow I just love it above all the others. The only thing I'd change about that watch is I wish it was in rose gold. I wish the case was in rose gold, but that would really be something. But I suspect that's a little bit out of my current price range. So cheers for now, and I'll see you again in part 2 of this video, which I'll make once I've had a cup of tea. Bye for now.